Chairman. It's my pleasure and honor to be participating in this program. And part of the reason is that Ajay Chaturvedi and I worked together in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And we were good friends then, and we continue to be good friends now. Now, as far as Mr. Gurumurthy's keynote address is concerned, I think that that's at a philosophical level. And my focus will be more on the ground, on the nuts and bolts, to the extent that I am familiar with the subject. You know, self-reliance in defense production has been a very major but elusive goal of Indian government policy for the last 70 years. And despite all our intentions, despite all our efforts, the needle of self-reliance has hovered at about 30% versus 70% imports. In fact, the irony is that even 70 years now later, we really don't have a robust index of self-reliance in defense manufacturing. Because when we talk about orders being placed on Indian domestic industry, that is one thing. But the Indian domestic industry itself has large import content in what it produces and supplies to the armed forces. So there is a downside to the actual degree of self-reliance. And I think, so we broadly talk about 70-30 or 30-70, but nobody really has the robust data about the extent of indigenization that has actually happened in the country. I think even in answers to parliament questions, sometimes the figures that are given out are the orders placed on domestic industry, with a caveat that how much the domestic industry is importing is something on which information is not readily available. So when we talk about self-reliance now, we're talking in terms of broad impressionistic terms based on the data. Now, we've not been able to move the needle very much forward, despite various initiatives starting. A large number of initiatives was taken in 2000, 2001, and there has been a flurry of initiatives after 2014. And the initiatives certainly reveal the intent of the government to push indigenous manufacturing. The extent to which we've succeeded is a matter on which I will try to explain and bring out the issues and challenges. Now, one of the key parameters is FDI. We've gone from 0% FDI to 26% in 2001, then 49% in 2014, 74% I think in 2019, and even 100%. But the FDI inflows over the last 20 years have been about maybe $500 million, maybe about 3,000 crores. And even if you see the last 4 or 5 years, the inflows are running into a few $1 million each year. So if you were to look at the proof of the pudding, you don't see large numbers of FDI coming in terms of investment in manufacturing. As far as Indian industry is concerned, they have also been constrained because of lack of orders. So one indicator in terms of investment in manufacturing from FDI is certainly not very encouraging. Now, as far as issues and challenges are concerned, there are very many issues that come to mind. You know, we had a defense production and export policy has been promulgated in 2020. And the policy is very ambitious. It envisages that we get to $5 billion of defense exports by 2025. And I think $25 billion of domestic production by 2025. That roughly is a 30% compound growth of rate of growth per annum between 2020 and 25, which is over ambitious, because you can't really get to these numbers unless your defense budget is increasing at the same rate, and that there is the same amount of purchase being made from the Indian defense industry, because the defense industry does not produce unless there are orders. So unless the defense budget is increasing at commensurate rates of 20-25% per annum capital budget, this is not going to happen. So the point I would like to make is that when we look at defense production and export policy, I think the timeframes that we work on are driven by electoral compulsions and electoral cycles. And 5 years is too short a time frame. When we think strategically and plan strategically, we need to look at a 20-year perspective or a 15-year perspective. A 5-year perspective is too short and too narrow. And therefore, we must find some way of bridging the electoral cycle, bridging the change of governments if it happens, and enunciate a policy where we can stay the course for a 10 to 15 or 20-year period. If we don't do that, then I think we are stuck in an electoral cycle with short-term targets, which are aspirational targets, which are never going to be achieved. One of the major thrusts on indigenization, one of the issues that arises is indigenization at what cost? Is it that we are going to indigenize regardless of the cost? Mr. Gurumurthy did mention that we are no longer in a globalized world and globalization is dead. But does it mean that we produce an aircraft in India for 500 crores when we can import it from Russia for 350 crores? Or do we produce a basic trainer in India for 35 crores? We import it for 35 crores or produce it in India for 50 crores. So when we look at Atmanirbhar Bharat or we look at indigenization, one of the issues that stares us in the face is at what cost? Are we prepared to pay a higher cost? And if so, to what extent? And I think, therefore, when we talk of indigenization, it cannot be indiscriminate indigenization. Maybe there are certain weapon systems and platforms which we need strategically, for which we are prepared to pay a higher cost. We must identify those, focus on those, and build those, even if they're at a higher cost. But there are a large number of other platforms or other systems, equipment, which may not be strategically required, which we could continue to import. So I think indigenization does not mean 100% self-reliance. Atmanirbharta does not mean 100% self-reliance. Atmanirbharta means that we identify strategic systems and platforms which we must develop in this country from the point of view of national security, focus of them even though they are at a higher cost, and leave the rest aside for the time being. Because unless we have that focus, we try to do everything and we are not able to achieve what we set out to achieve. The Sukhoi 30 aircraft, for instance, to the best of my knowledge, can be imported from Russia at a lower price than the price at which HAL can assemble and manufacture it. And this has been going on for more than 20 years now. And similarly, there are other systems and platforms where the same dilemma stares us in the face. So this is one point I wanted to place before you. Atmanirbhar Bharat at what cost? And if so, how do we address this issue? One of the major problems in indigenization has been the disconnect between design and development, production, and acquisition. Unless these three functions are integrated, we are not able to do what we are supposed to do. And I will elaborate this by talking about DRDO. It is a myth to believe that we do not have make in India projects or make projects. People familiar with the defense procurement procedure and the defense acquisition procedure would know that there are certain categories of make or make in India projects. And these are projects where either there is an assurance of orders or there is some funding for the development cycle, for the project development cycle. Now, we have had very few successes. In fact, we have had very few starts of these make projects. But hidden in the DRDO budget, there are about 50 mission mode projects which are make in India projects. These are different from their R&D activities. These are projects with an outlay maybe about 30,000-40,000 crores of rupees, which are funded primarily from the DRDO budget, where the technologies are relatively well known, the technology risks are few, and the SQRs, the qualitative requirements, are based on what the armed forces have told them. So when you already have about 50 make projects within the DRDO system, about which nobody seems to be aware other than the DRDO, with outlays of 30,000-40,000 crores, those are the projects that we should focus on where the technology risks are low and get them to fruition. My understanding is that one of the problems that DRDO has been facing is to identify a development partner early in the project cycle. Because if you can identify a development partner in the project cycle, and then you can work with that partner to make these mission mode projects successful, then you have a situation where the partner can go on to become the supplier and he gets the final production orders. So if you really want to make a headway in bridging this gap between design and development and production and acquisition, we must somehow subject these DRDO mission mode projects to a closer scrutiny to see how the design and development can be linked with the production and the private sector brought into this system. Now, the current budget talks about 25% of the DRDO outlay being shared with the Indian private sector for research and development. That's a slightly different proposition, and I don't know how that modality is going to be finalized. But I would say that they're staring us in the face are 50 mission mode projects of the DRDO, which have a potential for commercialization, which could be commercialized, and which should be driven not by DRDO, but by the user, by the armed forces. So whether it's the Army or the Navy or the Air Force, they should be in the driver's seat. The funding should not be through the DRDO. The funding should be through the budget of the armed forces. And they should drive these projects to fruition with production partners from the private sector. So it's a low-hanging fruit which we could pluck if we so desire. The other point I wish to make is that it is related to this point that we talk about acquisition and we talk about procurement. Now, acquisition is a broader term and procurement is a narrower term. And in Indian context, we had a defense procurement procedure. Now we call it a defense acquisition procedure. So it really, if you look at acquisition, the way it is described or defined in the literature, I'll just share with you what I have with me. Acquisition is a broad term which goes beyond procurement and encompasses design, development, engineering, manufacture, testing, deployment, life cycle support, and disposal. So acquisition is a very wide-ranging term. That is how it is defined and understood in the UK, in USA, in South Korea, in Australia. I'm talking about major democratic countries. In India, we've always been confused. The acquisition function is a much more wide-ranging function than procurement. And it is because of this confusion that we've not been able to link the design and development with the production and the acquisition. And therefore, when we look at the entire spectrum of activities that are being brought under the umbrella, I think we need to carve out a new role for the acquisition function in the Defense Ministry, which brings within its fold all these facets of acquisition rather than just procurement, and which begins to then drive the entire process through a single coordinated mechanism. Related to this, if you see the rules of business and the allocation of business rules, you will find under the new Department of Military Affairs an entry which talks about indigenization. Now, it is ridiculous to have this entry in only the Department of Military Affairs. Every wing of the MOD, whether it's the armed forces, whether it's the acquisition wing, whether it's the defense production, is equally responsible for indigenization. And this again points to the disconnect in the way this whole function is produced. Indigenization is not the responsibility of DMA, it is the responsibility of every entity. So when we look at the allocation of business, we also need to decide who is going to do what kind of indigenization. Different types of indigenization need to be done by different entities. And who is overall coordinating and responsible for indigenization? Is it the Department of Defense Production? Is it the DRDO? Is it the Defense Secretary? Is it DMA? There's lack of clarity on this. So we need an overall umbrella And the US, for instance, used to have this as under the Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology and Logistics. They have now rejig their systems. But I think we need to look very carefully at the organizational structures in USA or UK, Australia, a few other countries, and not copy them, but certainly learn from them about how best we can integrate design, development, and production. One of the major challenges, this is my last point, one of the major challenges in defense procurement is the actual purchase orders being placed. Anybody from the industry will tell you that unless they get orders, they are not able to invest and survive. And by default in India, most of the orders seem to go to the Indian public sector. So the real challenge in indigenization and Atmanirbhar Bharat is not by more of the same by giving more orders to the public sector. We've tried it for 70 years and it doesn't seem to have succeeded. We need to have Indian private sector companies who can also now emerge and rise to the challenge and get the orders that need to flow to them. Now, my understanding is that in the US defense system, about 50% of the procurement is single source procurement or sole source procurement. So to put it in simple terms, the challenge is how do you do sole source procurement or single vendor procurement from a private sector entity? Because here you have to go through competitive bidding. You have to have an open and transparent process. The imperatives of democracy require you to do that. So do they in the United States. The United States, roughly about 50% of procurement is sole source procurement. And this is another policy challenge. While the alignment between design, development, production, and acquisition is one broad challenge, the other challenge is sole source procurement from the Indian private sector. And the way the US have tackled this problem, like they created the Defense Contract Audit Agency, I think in 1962 or 63 through a statute. Now this agency under the Pentagon has about 4,000 or 5,000 staff. And many of these auditors are actually physically stationed in the factories of Lockheed Martin or Boeing or even in Europe sometimes in Airbus and General Dynamics and so on. But at any point in time, you might have 50 auditors of the Defense Contract Audit Agency of the Pentagon sitting in a Boeing factory and auditing their costs. And once they've audited their costs, they are able to generate reports for the Pentagon about the actual cost of production and about the profit margins which can be allowed, and therefore create a negotiating position for the department to negotiate with the supplier. Now, this is something that I've been talking about for a long time, that if you are going sole source procurement without competitive bidding, then you have to do it on the basis of cost plus a certain 10-15% profit. The only way you can do that is if you understand what the costs are. And the only way you can understand costs is if you have sufficient number of cost auditors physically looking at these costs. Now, the system may not be perfect. No system is perfect. There have been problems with the system. There have been scandals. There have been allegations. But the fact of the matter is that it's still there. And they talk about keeping it under the Pentagon. They talk about keeping it independent of the Pentagon. But the Defense Contract Audit Agency is a key instrument in the US system to encourage single vendor procurement from the private sector. And I think if we could somehow break this Gordian knot and let's say place an order on L&T or place an order on Bharat Forge or place an order on anybody who is best equipped to supply whatever the armed forces need on a sole source basis, we could have stopped this problem. You could have cut through this Gordian knot. Because that's precisely what we do with the Indian public sector. We place an order on them, there's some mumbo jumbo about costs. We agree on a figure and we then buy. And similarly, we do it with foreign vendors. When we did the Mirage upgrade, we went back to Thales and Dassault and said, listen, we bought this from you 20 years ago. Now we want to upgrade it. How much will it cost us? There was no competitive bidding. We So, the single vendor procurement is required not just for the initial order, but also for repeat orders. You can't expect 10 companies in India to be manufacturing submarines. You might have one or two. And therefore, when you want to manufacture a next generation submarine, or you want to do a refit, or you want to do an upgrade, you've got to go back to the same guy. The question is, how much do you pay him then? And if you don't have a mechanism to determine that, then you're always open to all kinds of allegations and scandals and things of that kind. So one of the missing gaps in our framework, I think, is somehow to move ahead on these lines. And I thought I would share with you my information about the Defense Contract Audit Agency. I will stop here because the time is running short, and happy to continue and join in the discussion. Thank you.